Hello and welcome to our colloquium on South Asian Studies at Yale. My name is Rohit today. I'm an associate professor of history and I'm the chair of the South Asian Studies Council this year. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Soumya Roy for a discussion of her new book, Mountain Tales, Love and Loss in the Municipality of Castaway Belongings. Soumya is a journalist and activist based in Mumbai and has had a long career of writing for a range of publications from Forbes India, Mint, Outlook Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, Wire, Bloomberg News, amongst others. Over the last decade, she co-founded Vandana Foundation that supports the livelihood of many of Mumbai's poorest micro-entrepreneurs by giving small low-interest loans. She's received fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, the Blue Mountain Center, the Carey Institute for Global Good, and Sangam House to work on this book, which has been a project of many years standing. And her work engages with not just questions of urbanization, but also the environmental humanities and research on how people live in the world's new mega cities. She was a fellow of the National Foundation of India in 2012 and has master's degrees in journalism from Columbia University and from Mumbai's Sophia College, where she also teaches magazine writing. In our panel today, we are joined by two anthropologists from Yale. I want to also welcome Sophia Abbas. Sophia is an anthropologist whose research lies at the intersection between post-colonial urbanization, land disputes, and the anthropology of aspirations. She's currently doing fieldwork looking at the rapid and ongoing urban transformation of the landscape that exists outside Delhi, and her research site is Manesar, a small peri-urban town on the border of Delhi and Haryana, where there's been a massive conversion of agrarian land for urban development. Our second respondent is Shalini Iyengar, who is also a doctoral student in the anthropology program, working at the intersection of environmental and legal rights, environmental anthropology, and a history of the Bay of Bengal littoral region. Prior to coming to Yale, Shalini taught law and policy at the School of Law, Environment and Planning at the Carey Institute in Bangalore. She's practiced law as a trainee solicitor in London and Shanghai, and taught at the National Law School of India, Bangalore, the Foreign Services Institute, and the ESSCA School of Management in Shanghai. Shalini is a lawyer by training with law degrees from the NLSIU Bangalore and several law degrees from Stanford, Oxford, and the International University College at Turin. So Soumya, thank you for taking our time to talk about the book with us. And I wanted to invite you to perhaps begin to telling us a little bit about how you arrived at the project and the kind of work you've been doing to produce this book over the last few years.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for having me here at this. I want to thank you. I want to thank the South Asian Students Council for having me in this fall lecture series. And I want to thank you for supporting this book over a while, actually. I have, of course, known and admired your work for many years, but you also many times, when I saw these unnotable tangles in court, court hearings, which I attended to follow the court case to close the garbage mountains that I have written about, and these tangles seemed, unknotable. Then sometimes I would call and ask, what is going on? And the court case has been going on for 26 years, and so it was often stuck, obviously. And yet, by talking to you, I was able to see some light seeping in through which those knots just became clearer, if not resolved. So thank you for supporting this book project and for having me here. You did set me this task of speaking about the book. And so what I did was I actually wrote something which might be a little shorter than the time that you've set me, I hope. But I was thinking about, I have been talking at various platforms about how I began writing this book, etc. But what I thought about speaking about today is what I titled The Magic Art of Making the Invisible Visible. Yeah. I believe that journalists, and even more so writers, are not always those who are voluble, but those who sit in quiet corners of busy rooms watching people, their relationships, their frailties, their secret aspirations unfold. We watch people in these busy rooms and in other quieter rooms in moments when their carefully held outer selves slip and their long held traumas surface. That is how I reported my book, Castaway Mountain, the non-fiction book about the garbage mountains of Mumbai and the waste pickers who trawl them. I had been a journalist in Mumbai for nearly a decade, and then in 2010, I co founded my nonprofit Vandana Foundation, through which we gave microloans to the city's poorest micro entrepreneurs. In the summer of 2013, we began getting waste pickers from Mumbai's garbage mountains at the far edge of the city asking for our loans. I had heard of these mountains made of the city's trash, but never seen them. I saw the waste pickers' limbs filled with cuts and bruises from collecting the detritus of our lives and that had accumulated there for more than 122 years. Every day, the waste pickers told me they walked up the nearly 120 feet high garbage mountains, as tall as 18-floor buildings. They filled trash into outsized bags and bundles that they held precariously on their heads. Then they walked down the slopes, the trash bundles hanging over their eyes, sorted through the trash in their skinny lanes, and resold plastic, glass, metal, or cloth to garbage traders. How would they grow this business they did? By filling the mountains into their arms and on their heads, I asked, worried that our loans would go bad. Kachra kadi kami honar ka, Vitabai Kamble, one of the oldest waste pickers at Deonar, had retorted. Will waste ever reduce? She worked in one of the city's fastest growing industries, she suggested. While I saw the cuts and bruises that formed a map of her 4 decades spent on the mountains, she told me about the forgotten treasures sent mistakenly in trash. I began giving loans, but also visiting their homes in the shadow of the mountains. They told me of finding gold dust mingled with city dust, tightly rolled currency notes, and forgotten jewelry in the trash. I saw their calves nearly bowed from walking down the garbage slopes made of nearly 16 million metric tons of trash, carrying bundles on their head. The Deonar dumping grounds, as they were officially called, were known for their stink, their unseemly sights, and the fires that burnt on them when decomposing trash met Mumbai's burning sun. But when I tried poking at the cracks between what they said and what I saw, I encountered a cheerful but fierce defiance that had kept them working on the mountains for years or even decades. I tried asking if the smell and the smoke bothered them, and Vetabai said those who didn't want to come here were the ones who ended up here and were the happiest here. Then, in January 2016, the mountains had erupted in fires that threw up clouds of smoke over much of the city, sickening residents. Pickers began getting detained by police for lighting the fires. New security guards arrived, lights arrived, cameras arrived, boundary wall began getting fixed, and a court case to stop dumping garbage on the mountains began again. It was as if these mountains and their toxic shadow had entered the city after all these decades of staying invisible. I prodded harder to learn what it was like for pickers to have lived in the nearly century long gap between policy and implementation in moving these mountains. What it was like to live in the more than 2 decade long delays in meeting court orders to fix the mountains. How were these lives lived in the thickening fog of noxious gases over the mountains to be accounted for? How was this unspoken trauma to be seen and expressed and written about? I had read official reports that said life expectancy in this ward was 39 years. I read scientific reports that spoke of methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide hovering over the mountains. This could cause asthma, nausea, dizziness, indigestion, irritated eyes. Tuberculosis was rampant from living here. Two of the waste pickers I had followed while reporting this book had died during the research. And yet, when I asked Haider Ali, a waste picker who had lived there for 2 decades, he replied, Humko kya hua hai? What is wrong with me? He said, suggesting nothing at all. One day, while writing notes on my desk, I thought, why was I not taking down Haider Ali and other pickers' accounts of seeing shaitans, khabis, chudails, rakshas, and other Hindu and Islamic spirits floating above the mountains? Spitting on the slopes manifested rakshasas or demons, Vitabai told me. Such spirits tripped them on the slopes, the pickers said. They asked for rent for the homes pickers made from thrown away plastic sheets, pickers said. One had asked Haider Ali's friend Muharram Ali to return a white cloth scrap that he had collected. It was her shroud, he told me she had said. The shaitans, who were spirits that arose from dark and filthy recesses, possessed the pickers, they believed. Haider Ali believed they had possessed the fourth of his 6 daughters, Farzana, soon after the 2016 fires at Deonar. The shaitan gripped her, sickened her and others, and caused accidents that could even be fatal, he believed. Once when I met him, Hyder Ali, and even often when I met him, Hyder Ali spoke of spending on trying different rituals and traditional remedies to exorcise the spirits. I, on the other hand, suggested they visit doctors, which they also did, but which didn't always work. I told him Farzana's illness might be due to the gases she had inhaled on the mountains from working through the smoke and the fires that sickened residents and even in distant parts of the city. In February 2016, weeks after the fires began, a Bombay High Court order banned construction that added built space in the city until the mountains were fixed. I began going to court and immediately felt the mountains would move, and with it, pickers' lives. I watched deadlines getting set, indignation at them not being met, new ones being fixed and almost being met. I noticed that but then I noticed that the case to fix the mountains had begun in 1996. I tried obtaining case papers, but around this time, court proceedings were excluded from the Right to Information Act. But the more I visited court, I wanted to know why this nearly resolved problem had not gotten resolved. After a years long attempt, which would actually make a book of its own, I obtained case papers for the more than 2 decades the case had gone on. I read of deadlines being set, indignation at them not being met, the plans nearly coming, and even a contempt of court case for deadlines not being met. And yet, the mountains had only grown, their noxious gases thickening, only to sicken pickers. Just as the case had quivered only to stay in place, the mountains had quivered and stayed in place too, only to press their dark imprint on pickers' bodies and lives. How were these extraordinarily large forces or policy gaps to be processed by pickers? Had they resorted to what they knew, the ancient religious myths passed down to them, to understand these administrative gaps that made a dark print on their lives? I had often chatted with Hyder Ali about the court case, how toxic gases could ossify or weaken their lungs. Living in their packed homes could exacerbate tuberculosis. But the gaunt and always cheerful Hyder Ali would reply, saying he had seen dismembered human limbs, dead bodies in the city's detritus thrown on the mountains. Shaitans arose from them, he told me. One of them had gripped his daughter only to trip her and hurt her. My rationalism and the skepticism honed through my journalistic training made me ask why the shaitan had gripped his daughter Farzana. "Wo khoobsurat hai na, she is so beautiful," is the only way he could explain. At my prodding, he began switching on television news and trying to understand all I told him about court cases, police cases, fires, pollution. And on my part, I had to accept that his explanation about the shaitans would be a way of processing and truth telling about the impact of the mountains on their bodies and their minds. While my telling of the Deonar Mountains would have to include court proceedings, reports on the lurching attempts to make a waste to energy plant, they would also have to include Hyder Ali's and other pickers' accounts of the mountains. In July 2020, I had watched Justice Abhay Oak, who had presided over the Deonar case for years, give a virtual speech to law students in India where he spoke of how he had started out as a young lawyer 3 decades ago. At first, he received briefs only from litigants who couldn't afford any better. Oak said, "When you connect with such litigants, you learn what life is about." After becoming a judge, he realized the real challenge before our legal system is not of docket explosion, but docket exclusion. He went on, "There are certain deficiencies in our legal system that large sections of our population silently suffer injustice. While the unending pile of pending cases clogging Indian courts had often been spoken about, Oak suggested the bigger problem was that people like Farzana and the inhabitants of Karwale, a hamlet just outside the city that had been raised so that waste from the Deonar dumping grounds could eventually move there, remained invisible to courts. Given that their fates were being decided by forces they neither knew, understood, nor participated in, Hyder Ali and other pickers had expressed the trauma of living here in the way they knew best. And I had to learn to listen and make space for it in my retelling. Were their accounts too fantastical? I wondered once when Farzana's brother-in-law Ismail told me of a time when she had fainted on the garbage slopes, tripped by the shaitan. It was bound to happen if she worked during the afternoon, Ismail told Sahani, his wife and Farzana's older sister. The thing about the shaitans was, he explained to me, that they came out in the day from around 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. and then from midnight to around 2:30 a.m. इसके लिए मैं उसके बाद ही काम पे जाता था, उनका साया पड़े ही ना. I worked only after that so that even their shadow didn't fall on me. Then I read an interview Gabriel Garcia Marquez, maybe the best known journalist and novelist, once gave the Paris Review. He says, The trouble is that many people believe I'm a writer of fantastic fiction when actually I'm a very realistic person. And I write what I believe is true socialist realism. The realism Marquez spoke about entailed, I thought, listening, absorbing, and giving space to his subjects without the condescension of interpretation. This in itself brought out their inner lives and the trauma of living in a place like this, living lives like they did. In fact, I found the intractable, unyielding mountains had taken a life of their own, even in official municipal accounts of them. The dumping grounds had been, I mean, I've talked about the history about it a little bit, but even in official accounts, they spoke of the mountains erupting in spontaneous fires. These accounts spoke of the mountains expanding with the monsoon, contracting with the summer, and staying firmly out of official attempts to fix them, reflecting official frustration. As a writer, I had to learn to listen to those whose lives were intertwined with the mountains, absorb and give space to their voices, both pickers and officials. Sometimes I'm asked, what do I think will break this century-old deadlock? And I can only say that I wish something that works, includes all those whose lives are inextricably tied to the mountains, and that ends their unaccounted and unspoken trauma. The mountains had grown because city residents had sent their waste to stay invisible in this far edge of the city. As a writer, all I could do was watch for years and by writing, make the invisible visible.
Thank you, Soumya, for such a lyrical introduction to some of the process of sort of gathering this information and thinking, pushing us to think about a city that's inhabited by things that we choose to make invisible, like garbage dumps, but also things that are perhaps invisible if they're real, like the shaitan. I'm going to invite Shalini to perhaps come in now and offer her comments.
Sure, happy to. Soumya, thank you so much. This is a beautiful book, and it was an absolute pleasure to read. And thank you also to Professor Day and the South Asia Council for this invitation to speak here. I loved reading the book, and I'm not sure I can do it justice, especially after your wonderful introduction, Soumya. But when I was thinking about what to write, what to speak, since I trained as a lawyer in a previous life, I thought I could sketch out a brief background to the legal cases discussed in the book and offer a few thoughts on why the book I felt was particularly compelling for me. The book deals with waste management in Mumbai and the lives of those who live along the Deonar township and the background of decades of litigation and administrative malaise that plagued waste and its management. And I think, as Soumya notes in her book, the story is that of Mumbai and they're all the specificities of life in the city. But it's also a very universal story, right? What do we do with the increasing amounts of waste we produce, particularly given the density of urban infrastructures around the world today? In India, there are a multiplicity of laws that manage and prevent pollution. And pollution is technically a topic that state and center and the municipal levels share responsibility for through a tangled mass of legislations. And the critical piece of legislation in this story is the Environment Protection Act, the EPA, which was passed by the central government in '86. And it is primarily a framework law that gives the central government wide-ranging powers to draft rules for protecting the environment and controlling pollution. What has happened, though, in spite of having a number of laws, and this will be a story, it's an Indian story, it's also a global story that many will be familiar with. Although the laws have fairly stringent provisions, it would not be incorrect to say that they've frequently been honored in the breach. This is in part due to the nature of environmental laws themselves. They are generally what is called non-self-executing, by which I mean that they require policies and legislations coupled with the often elusive political and administrative will in order to be fully realized. Courts in India have long been active in environmental matters in India, and some of the most significant jurisprudence emerged from the 1980s onwards. Rightly or wrongly, these decisions cemented the court's activist reputation, since they introduced the concept, among other things, of public interest litigation and relaxed rules, making it easier for affected persons and concerned citizens to approach the courts. And the court's role has really transformed from a dispute resolution to a management and prevention sort of role. And this has, of course, been controversial. On the one hand, the courts have been seen as the last recourse for accessing and enforcing environmental rights. But on the other hand, there have been many who argue that courts are not the proper forum to determine matters which are considered as being those of polycentric governance, given that these political and policy issues require a balancing of competing interests. Many have felt that these should be left to democratically elected institutions. And so, as you can imagine, these are very charged issues with no real easy answers. And I think what makes your book so fascinating, Soumya, is that it's haunting, and sometimes literally, as you pointed out, is a way in which you've centered the communities affected by the vagaries of law and state at the heart of the book. And there are so many intertwined issues. We see a community constituted by space and occupation. I think one of the running threads of the book is this idea that you can come to the waste mountains, but very few escape its shadows. We hear of these mountains, the efforts to evict residents of irregular settlements, which is endemic in many parts of India, urban politics, public health, environmental rights, and that's just a few. And you've really, I think, emphasized the disadvantages conferred by these intersectional interactions of religion, gender, region, caste, class. And I think the book really shines a light on precarity and the tensions between the aspirations that the pickers have for both legibility, but also a desire for invisibility and to be left alone by the state. So there's this ongoing tension in the book, which I think is really, really fascinating. And I think perhaps on a more meta level, the book really shows us the way that urban imaginaries come into being and the futures that are being made through these aspirations and frustrations of urban dwellers. And I think it raises fundamental questions. So who is the city for? Who bears the costs of these dreams we have for urban futures? And perhaps the most fundamental is that what does it take to push back against reductive imaginaries of urban citizenship towards a much more inclusive understanding of belonging? And this is something you highlighted as well. I think I'll pause my comments for now. I think that's all I have to say at the moment. But again, thoroughly enjoyed the book and very much looking forward to the discussion that follows.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Sophia, Abbas.
Hi, Soumya. Thank you for joining, and also thank you, Rohit, for inviting me and for exposing me to this extremely beautiful and insightful book by Soumya. I'm really glad that I could read it and that I could be here to sort of say a little bit more about what I thought, but also that I was exposed to this sort of genre of writing style and storytelling and format, which is a breath of fresh air from sort of all of the academic reading that we're all used to. So I have sort of, to keep track of time, I have, my comments are sort of interspersed with some questions, and I'm going to kind of read them out, but they might sound a bit repetitive to you because they are sort of a mini commentary on the book describing what I think in brief your book is about. But also in between, I've introduced some questions, and if you could take them on whenever you get a chance to speak. So, Mountain Tales is the story of the lives, livelihoods, aspirations, struggles, and precarities spanning across 4 families of waste pickers living at and off the 122-year-old waste mountains of Deonar in the city of Mumbai, which is perhaps one among the largest landfills in the world. While the story centers on the quotidian life of these waste pickers and their attempts to transform waste into value, it is through them and the life that they inhabit in this parallel city of waste that you also narrate both the cultural, political, and spatial history of the city of Bombay. This history, of course, is interspersed across the entire book, but it comes out very specifically in the 2nd chapter. This is where you outline how the history of the waste mountains of Deonar come about, they really emerge, and how this area gets set aside as an area by the colonial government in 1897 to control the spread of the bubonic plague, where trash starts arriving on trains. It is here that we learn about how Deonar grows as Bombay thrives, both pre and post-independence, amidst administrative plans, land disputes, evictions, dispossession, and communal violence. In writing this book, then, you display a combination of methods that include archival research, delving into colonial records, ethnography, everyday interactions, both personal and professional, that combine to produce almost its own genre of writing and storytelling. So when I was reading this book, the sort of really fine, detailed, evocative, striking writing prose often also seem to blur the boundaries between what is conventionally thought of as fictional and non-fictional writing. And yet I'm constantly reminded that these indeed are real people on a real mountain. How do you, as the narrator documenting these stories, understand and conceive of this genre? Can you say more about the choice of your writing style? Additionally, at a time when anthropologists like us especially, and researchers, anthropologists of course are never absolved of this question, but generally, all of us are once again being made to confront this question of positionality. Where do you place yourself within the story? How do these people whose stories and lives you document respond to your intention to document their lives? How did you navigate where and how to insert yourself in the story? Secondly, as you tell the story of a city composed from the excess of Bombay, you embrace this question that we as privileged city dwellers always avoid. Where does waste really go? What is its afterlife? And how does it overlap and transform into value for the residents of Deonar, creating a life world so distinct from ours? But constantly you remind us also that beyond being a story of these people, it is also a story of so much more. What do you think this something more really is? What do you want a broader audience of global readers to take away from this account of Deonar and India? Basically zooming out, what were you thinking? Thirdly, as you trace the life of these court cases over the mountains, you tell us about concerned citizens, municipality officers, private real estate companies, the Tattvas and the Tatas, the different juries and judges that preside over this long, never-ending case. But also, could you tell us a little bit more about the people's relationship and responses to the case? Of course, we get to know this and get to read this in the book as well. But I would love for you to sort of say more to this now. In some cases, you mentioned that they navigated around these newly imposed rules and walls that come up, while in other instances, they looked forward to the changes that may potentially accompany the new court orders in the form of acquiring municipal worker cards and formal state employment. What do you make of this relationship between your interlocutors and the state vis-a-vis the courts? And finally, the book ends on a note of some kind of an impasse with the court case. So what is the status of these mountains legally in the current moment? And both in terms of where things lie with the legal case, but also what is happening to these people who make this place. Basically, I want to know about what's happening to Farzana. Also, because where you end is sort of where the pandemic also begins. So what has and if the pandemic has told us something, it has that it is no sort of equalizer, and the story also is similar in many ways. So what really happened here during this time, if you know, and you could speak to that. And finally, additionally, as a follow-up question to this, where do you locate change in this situation, and what do you think meaningful change will be? As a researcher of these waste mountains, what do you see and what measures do you consider as genuinely meaningful and relevant that can positively sort of transform and improve things? I think that's where I would end. I had a bunch of questions that I had noted down. But also thank you again, Soumya, for putting this all together. It's absolutely beautiful.
Soumya, I'm going to invite you to respond to some of the questions, and then we'll open it up for a larger discussion amongst the group.
Sure. So I thank you, Shalini and Sophia, for your extremely sensitive and thoughtful reading, your comments, and Sophia for your questions. I did try noting at least some of them down. I think you began by asking, how did I come upon this writing style to begin with? And maybe I can begin by telling you that while I was a journalist, this was very different from journalistic writing, right? And I think it came from being very closely, immersed in the subject material, which is at first the lives of the pickers. We entered through what was their business, what were their livelihoods, how could we support them, and in order to support them, we needed to know more about them. So it just began with that. But having said that, I think, yeah. So it began with really knowing about waste pickers' lives. Even in loan interviews, many times they would tell you about their trauma, their or their dreams, their aspirations. You go to their house, they tell you about their families, how a small health setback could just set them back, wipe away their savings. And so you got to know a lot about even family lives through their businesses, through their work, I should say. So I began with documenting that. But having said that, excuse me, it became clear to me that their lives were intertwined with the mountains. And a story of the mountains could not be told without the pickers, and the story of the pickers could not be told without the mountains. And I think one of the great misconceptions about the poor is that, oh, they are poor because they're lazy or they're crazy and they're just not making a great effort. But actually, it was very important to show that these mountains and, the policy gaps and the administrative malaise and the court delays were actually pressing down on these people. Sometimes things like, as journalists, we become so interested in fixing responsibility for things like corruption or delays or malaise, that we begin to look at corruption or delays, inefficiency as a victimless crime. We only want to say that why did the person do it? We don't write so much about what impact did it have. And here I was trying to show the imprint of that delay. It may be totally unintentional, which I believe it was, but what impact was that having on pickers' lives? And that is how, I think that the story of the mountains could not be told without the pickers, and the story of the pickers could not be told without the mountains. And so you had these interweaving chapters of their lives and the mountains and the impact of the mountains on their lives. And so that's how that story was very naturally came together. I think the next question that you have is, how do the characters respond? My positionality. Okay, so this is another very interesting subject, which is that basically it's something that I struggled with, as many writers do. And one of the results of that is that there are two different editions of the book written in two different voices. This is a rare such book. I can see that the discussants here have read two versions of the book. Castaway Mountain. So at first it was sold in the UK. I wrote it as a journalist, the early drafts, and my editor who bought it in the UK said, everything is great except you need to be in it. Your positionality needs to be clear. How did you enter? That you had a lending role in their lives at first, that you had a pre-dating relationship with them before you even began to write. You should reflect correctly to the reader who you are. And excuse me, while my journalistic training had never trained me for that, I was thrown by it, but I accepted her point that yes, I did have a pre-existing relationship that needed to be clarified, and that also brought some insight into the pickers' lives. And so Mountain Tales, the UK edition, was written with bits of first-person insights in it. When it was acquired in the US, my editor had one suggestion, which is that it's reading so much like a novel, and it is so much a play on what is real and what is not real, what is fictional and what is not fictional, that you should not be in it. You're coming between the reader and the story, and I absolutely accepted what she said, because I do agree. I think that I'm there in the introduction, so the reader knows that this is not they're not being deceived. But by the same token, while reading the book, they should read it for the story itself and be moved by the characters rather than by my coming between them and creating the distance between the story and the reader. So I do think that my positionality is clarified in both versions of the book, even in the US one, by my being there in the introduction as well as in the conclusions. But yes, I'm not there throughout, stomping between me and the story, as you could possibly say. And of course, in the UK edition, my positionality is super clear by my being there almost the whole time. So that's on positionality. I think you asked, what do the characters think? They're happy. I spent publication day with many of them, giving them the book. And Hira Siddiqui, who's in the book, actually said, "Kisi ko pata to chalega hum kaise jiye." Right? And that, which is exactly the title of my talk, making the invisible visible, right? Like, what can a solution be? Part of the solution is by making trauma visible, by making their lives visible, by making the fact that their lives are built on our trash, that itself means something to them. And that does make them, I wouldn't say make them happy, but it does act as a balm for them. After all these years of living in invisibility, that does act as some kind of a balm for them. So that's what the characters feel about the book. Many of them wanted to participate in different ways. I should also quickly say that we stopped lending. I stopped lending before I began writing this book, so that they were speaking only for their stories to be told, not for any other kind of enticement. So that was another thing that I have to keep in mind. I think another of your questions is, what would I like the takeaway from this to be? I would like the takeaway, as any book, you want the reader to be moved by this. I never wanted it to be heavy-handed. I wanted the reader to be moved like any good fiction book. I used a lot of detail, like tiny bits of detail, but it came together to tell a larger story. And I remember being just interviewed a few weeks ago, and by the California EPA secretary, and he said this book is about what it means to be human. And so all the detail came together to ask some larger questions of us as a society who were sending trash there, about the lives that were being built, or what even gave meaning to us. What we were throwing away was also defined. We thought that doesn't define us. We accumulate new things in a few more months thinking that elevates us. And yet it doesn't, because if it did, it wouldn't end up there. And so I wanted this book to, first of all, for you to be immersed in this world made of your trash, in these lives made of our trash. And when you, like in any good fiction book, when you emerge from that world, you are a little bit different, you are a little bit transformed. And that is the deepest and gentlest transformation that I would want any reader to experience, a very visceral experience. So most of all, I would want that. What do pickers think of cases? They have a bittersweet relationship with the cases. They cannot impact the cases. They know it's a backdrop in their life. Every little while, security gets tight, they're not allowed to go, and they know something has happened in court. At other times, they know that the court cases are going on, but they're not impacting them. Like Ismail, who's quoted here, once told me, "Wo to hamare bachpan se chal raha hai, abhi tak kuch hua nahi hai." So sometimes they know that it's going on and it doesn't impact them, and sometimes they know that it is going on and it will impact them in a very dire way. So now, since the 2016 fires, certainly there has been a great tightening in security, etc. And so many of the waste pickers, or the characters in this book, are continuing. They're making frantic attempts to leave, but many are continuing to work there. And they work before dawn, before guards arrive, pay them bribes, but they continue to work because this is the only life that they know, right? You asked about COVID, I think. On the case is still going on. There has not been a hearing recently over the last year, little over a year. There is no real hearing that has happened. There is a waste plant now that is supposed to come up by 2023. So it's a much smaller plant than was originally planned, but they are planning 3 plants, and I hope that this time it does come. As for the characters, their lives are lurching. Jahangir is still in jail. It's been 2.5 years. 3 years he's been in jail. Farzana is expecting her 3rd child any day. I think she still suffers from tuberculosis that she does not get treated. So that's their lives are lurching, very much like what you see in the book. Not much has changed, except that certainly they're holding the books in their hands. But other than that, I wouldn't say that things have changed too much. Farzana's younger sister Farah continues to work on the mountains. What do you think? What do I feel should change? There's a lot of debate and a lot of discussion on what the right solution should be. Should it be a waste to power plant, a waste to compost plant? Should it be, zero waste? Many cities go for zero waste. I know there's a lot of experts on either side. This is a very heated kind of a debate. The anti-incinerator lobby, the pro-incinerator lobby. And my only view on this is that it cannot be only a technological solution. That policy planners sometimes think that this grand technology is going to come and solve their problems, but in fact, I think that any solution would have to include the lives of those who are intertwined with this place. Like now for the waste to power plant, the project document says there is no relief and rehabilitation required because nobody lives off of these mountains. Whereas the only things that were taken away from the mountains were taken by these waste pickers.
Thank you so much, Soumya. So we're going to switch to taking questions from the audience. I'd like to also briefly introduce Akshaya Tankha, the Malti Singh postdoctoral fellow at Yale, who will be helping me moderate. Akshaya is an art historian and is looking at the relationship between new forms of indigeneity and art in India's Northeast, particularly Nagaland. I wanted to sort of start us off, maybe by picking up from your last comment, which is thinking about the one thing that's very present in your narrative, almost as a real person, is the administration in Bombay in different ways. So, like the shaitans, they also pop up in different places and have multiple motives. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about um, there are certain figures who become regular players in the life of this mountain. I mean, you mentioned Justice Oka, but there are also some figures in the municipal administration or people sort of working in the sanitation department who also have a kind of, a very different relationship, but a kind of continuing relationship. And it's clear that they don't all see this as the same place. So just because they're in the city and the administration doesn't mean that they see this as the same. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about how the city or the administration has very different views of seeing this space as well.
Yeah, sure. It's a little bit like, as you were asking this question, I was thinking about it as, that famous story about the elephant, and different people are touching it in different ways and seeing it in different ways. So I think that I'm often asked that I see this as a colonial legacy, as a colonial problem, but I actually also see this as a post-colonial problem. That while the British administration had, rightly or wrongly, they had a whole scheme, that this would be profitable, this would fill up the swamp, and then they would actually make money off of it. What actually happened was that after that, the city grew tremendously. Bombay became the capital of Maharashtra and it began to grow very quickly. And waste began to fill here quite meteorically. And it was as if the city administrators were so busy managing this city and growing. This was supposed to be or is not only the commercial capital of India, but seen as a global city with global aspirations. And they were growing it in that way. I've talked about how the stock exchange came, tenements went, slums went. They were caught up with all that, and it was as if they turned around and saw there were 12 million metric tons of trash. And from that point, 96 onwards, when I actually got written court documents on this issue, it's clear that they see it as this intractable problem that they do intend to solve, but that is staying out of their hands, because while they looked away, this has become so huge that it's taken on a life of its own, like many post-colonial problems. The garbage mountains have almost taken on a life of their own. So I have this incident in the book where the municipal commissioner at the time goes there. In fact, there's one municipal commissioner. Many of them actually spoke to me, but wanted to speak off the record. And one of them spoke to me having gone there for some other work. And he said, I had heard about them, but when I saw them, they were mountains. They were to parvat the. They were like towering mountains, which he had never expected. So it was literally like they had turned back after 4 or 5 decades and woken up to this place, which was so huge that it was unmovable, that it really was not easy to move. And so I sense their frustration, a very genuine kind of frustration, that they are trying all kinds of different things, even making a boundary wall. For 26 years, this debate has been going on, that how is a boundary wall to be made, and this place just staying out of their grasp, them trying different things, and the place almost having volition and staying out of their grasp, because it was so big that it almost had a life of its own.
We're getting some questions, so I'll just read out the first one. It asks, could you speak a little about how you explored inequality in the context, those who send the trash there and those that pick it up? particularly given the point you made about feeling a connection with the place?
So I thought that, I thought that this book was a reflection of ourselves. It was not. It was not only a reflection. That, as I said, it was not that these waste pickers were living there because they were lazy or they were crazy, but that this was a world made of our desires, and. So these mountains provided a reflection. Of course, this was the world that was inhabited physically by those pickers, but it was a world made by us. And that then the mountains therefore became a symbol of inequality, as the questioner has asked. And so many times I saw the ends of our consumption there. Like I have photographs of this young child using blush on that she found there, purple eyeshadow that she found there, and she's using it, which means nothing to her in her life, but it means something because it arrived there. City fashion, city food, ready to eat arrives there, jewelry arrives there, and they are. And for us, that it has gone there because it means nothing. So the mountains became this sharp rift to explore, and this growing rift with which to explore inequality. The kind of flooring that was used in houses, mosaic arrived there, but marble was used in the city and sometimes mistakenly arrived there. And they hoped that we would forget something valuable.
Thank you for your response, Soumya. I'm going to take over the question and answer now. And in moving to the next question, I'm going to sort of piggyback on that question as well. So the question that's already been placed before you is, what were your literary influences in writing this book? And just to kind of piggyback on that question, one of the things that I was thinking about is that Mumbai is a city, has a long and storied career in sort of literature. It's been written about extensively over the decades. One can think of various genres of writing about the city as well. So to add to the question of what were your literary influences, I wanted to also ask you about what are the ways in which you found the city not being written about? And what perhaps from that kind of sort of negative lens motivated you to write this story? In a way, kind of sort of thinking about your presentation about making the invisible visible. So what are the visible ways in which literature has informed your writing this book? And what are the things that you found missing in the literature that pushed you to take on this project?
Sure. Thank you for that question. That's really a wonderful question that I will have to think about actually for a while to come up with. What were the things that I thought were not written about in the city, that the gaps that made me write it in a particular way. And I think one of the things that on this subject that I can tell you is that Bombay is often associated with gangs. There is this whole almost a genre of literature and movies and TV shows on Mumbai and its gangs. And it so happened that I couldn't write about the Deonar dumping grounds without writing about the gangs, because these were just waste traders who there was certain trash that could come, like household trash can come there, like say food, plastic, glass, that kind of thing can come there, but biomedical waste, for example, is not supposed to come there, or construction debris is not supposed to come there because it can release cause air pollution basically. And so larger waste traders had made cracks in the walls and are alleged to have brought it in to the dumping grounds. And one of the reasons, so it couldn't have been written without them. There was a story when I went there. There had already been a story in a city newspaper about these garbage traders. Court cases were going on, but for me, it was important to write about these traders because they existed in the gap of policy again. That if it was as if the municipality and the police and the administration also didn't want to deal with this place, its fires, and somewhere in that gap these traders had stepped in, right? And that almost pantomime of running the place but but leaving that space for these traders to function. And often when I speak to people elsewhere, they tell me this is how waste traders also grew in Italy, in New York, in Japan, where they often get waste contracts. So while waste traders are often written about, or not only waste traders, but gangs are often written about as outsized and glamorous, I felt that they were stepping in, and I don't mean this to be an apologist for them, but just a symbol, I should say, of administrative gaps, as were many other themes in the book. They like, I have this incident where one of them pours out water and tells the BMC officials that since you're not providing proper water supply, we will have to do it. And they were at night bringing in their garbage trucks. And so I talked about them as a way of also pointing out those gaps in administration that they stepped into, which is not to say that those were nice gaps. Those were dark gaps. Those were violent gaps sometimes. They were for children growing up. I mean, these were violent places to be because of growing traders. So I'm certainly not an apologist, but you do see a very different version of gangs in my book, I think, from what you see in some other books. So that was may or may not have been conscious, but certainly it was there. As for literary influences, I have spoken a little bit about that. I would say that I read Marquez. When I would come back in the evenings, I was going out to the Gavish Mountains. I was coming back every day and thinking, what am I seeing? What is going on here? And sometimes I would reach out to, sometimes I would call Rohit, but then sometimes I would reach out to something in my own library, like, what is going on here? And certainly there were times when I read Marquez and he talked about representing folkloric traditions to show the emotional processing of the experience, as against the forces of colonial narratives. So that was certainly, and that matched with what I was seeing on the Gavish Mountains, where they were resorting to ancient myths to explain these capital, you could say, forces of capitalism or post-colonial administration bearing down on them. So that was certainly where I found Marquez to be helpful. I also read Manto on the city, now that we're talking about the city, of people defying easy stereotyping. So I often read him for that. And, I think Bombay characters often tend to be irreverent, defy stereotypes of being, poor and pathetic, which is sort of an easy classification of people like this, and yet his characters are never like that. And so I think that certainly was an influence. I've spoken about Steinbeck, where I just coincidentally, before I began writing this book, happened to reread Grapes of Wrath, which is about farm laborers who came into California, and so that is his fictional work. But he's also written a non-fiction newspaper series called Harvest Gypsies on these migrant laborers in Depression era California, and he also maintained a diary of how he wrote this book called Working Days. It's a daily diary of how he wrote the book, experiencing self-doubt, getting through it. So that was a wonderful experience.
Thank you for sharing that, Soumya. That's, I think, in a very interesting and enriching way, it sort of speaks to some of the issues that Shalini had brought up as well, in terms of the sort of placing the situation in a global context. And certainly your sort of literary influences and stories resonate with that sort of global story that's unfolding in this very particular and local context. I think so. There's one more question I had that I could perhaps wait on that and sort of highlight one of the questions that's just been posted. I'm just going to read it out. The question is, could you reflect on your relationship, that is emerging relationship perhaps, it's the term emerging has been placed in brackets, with trash and its materiality, especially while researching for and writing this book? So I guess the question is about your relationship with trash and its materiality in the course of this book project.
My own personal relationship with trash?
Yeah, your emerging relationship, not personal, your emerging relationship with trash and its materiality.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering if the question is more my own personal view of it, or the picker's view of it. And I was reminded immediately of one of the pickers who said, "Kisi ka kachra, kisi ka bhangar hota hai," which is somebody's waste is somebody's scrap. That is what they build their life. Nothing for them is waste. And that's a wonderful thought to keep in mind when we think about our relationship with waste. And this whole philosophy of zero waste cities, it was something that waste pickers often told me, ki kachra nahi hai, ye bhangar hai, which means that it's scrap and something can be rebuilt anew off of it. You see them scraping. I've taken photographs of them scraping through wire to retrieve metal that they then sold. And for them, metal was the most expensive thing. That wire, that slim wire that you could almost not see, was one of the most expensive things you could find on the garbage mountains. And they actually lit fires to collect that metal. And so nothing for them was trash. I don't know if that answers the question or...
Certainly. Soumya, I had one more. So I'll come back to the question that I had. I guess this is partly a clarification, partly sort of thinking about this project in relation to the subjects that you've highlighted so well in your introduction and your response to the question so far. I'm wondering, is there any kind of sort of collective action that has been taken and mobilized by the waste pickers, or perhaps people dwelling in and near the sites that you look at?
Yes, there has been. There are different waste pickers organizations that do work there and that do represent them, in some informal identity or semi-formal identity cards being made for waste pickers. That waste pickers will tell you sometimes they're honored, at other times they're not honored. And this is a constant battle. Even now with the waste power plant that is being built, there was supposed to be a public hearing that some of the waste pickers and citizens groups actually pushed for. And in the end, when they had the public hearing, there was only one person who said, "I actually live here." So it's maybe the intention is to include them, but it is certainly, I don't think it's wrong to say that there is a rift, that there is not a very great dialogue between the two. The municipality is obviously managing the competing interests of securing this place and include the rules that say that waste pickers should be there, but they believe the waste pickers light fires and they're not incorrect. So it is this difficult dance to balance these competing interests.
Thank you for sharing that, Soumya. I don't think there are any more questions at the moment. So I'd like to sort of take this opportunity to throw open to the discussants and to the author if there's anything else you'd like to add about the book, about some of the concerns raised so far, or anything else that we might have missed out.
Okay, well, maybe others gather their thoughts. I'll ask probably an obvious question to people after they write their first books is, what are you thinking of as a future project, and sort of, are you thinking of building this body of research into something else further, or what are your sort of thoughts with regards to future plans?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that at this point I have another book planned or being worked on, but I am certainly right. I have been writing a few journalistic pieces related to threads of research. As you can imagine, there were things that didn't in the end make it into the book. For instance, I happened to get several residencies and traveled to different places to write my book, and everywhere I was looking for what was happening with trash. And obviously, this book was such a close-up with what was happening in Deonar. So while I do allude to this not being a problem exclusively of Deonar, I don't sort of go in too many different directions in the book itself. And I am now writing about landfills elsewhere in the world, how the similar threads of difficulties, challenges in resolving them, or even success stories in resolving them. So that's one of the themes that I am writing, but journalistic articles, not an entire book. I would also like to put up some of the research that I did, both on Deonar and on a fair amount on landfills elsewhere in the world, including in New York City, where close to where you are, on a website or as open source research for other researchers on this subject to use. So that's certainly a project that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Put up court documents, put up even pollution figures, because when I talk to friends working, say, in Moscow, they find that, yes, there was high levels of hydrogen sulfide and it smelled the same. Or there was high levels of methane even in Addis Ababa. And I think that might be of some value to researchers elsewhere.
Soumya, there's one more question that's just come in. And this is a question from Kelvin. And it asks, well, it says first, thank you so much, Professor Roy. Would you be willing to elaborate on the possibilities and challenges of drawing on non-secular modalities in analyzing political economy?
Could you just
I think the question is asking for you to elaborate on thinking about stories relating to spirits, the figure of the shaitan, for instance, in engaging with this sort of clear social and political concerns that you address in the book. What is, yeah.
I think that as a writer, as I said, I have said in, and that was one reason why I wrote about this today, because I think it was, as a journalist, we are trained obviously to look at, as I said in what I wrote, I think I'm best when I write about these things, is that we come from a sort of a rational background. And, even in my, in meetings with borrowers, when they said that, the shaitan tripped me, I would avoid it because I thought that, okay, I'm here to give a loan and, this is not my purview, or I'm not sure what is going on here, and leave it aside. But as I began researching the Castaway Mountains, it became clear to me that there were the multiple realities to this situation, to this place, and they all had to be told, that one could not be told without the other. And therefore, it could be that it was plastic pollution that was, sickening them. It could be that it was fires and smoke. Many of these waste pickers had worked through the 2016 smoke and fires that were actually caught on NASA satellites. And yet these people had tried to unsee them and continue to work because they needed to work. And so this could be the impact of fire and smoke. It could be the impact of generations of not getting enough nutrition, not seen through school, all of which I talk about in different strands in the book. But then along with that, this could also be a strand. And so I have tried not to give any extra or reduced weightage to any of the narratives, but write them as multiple realities, multiple possibilities. As a writer, I felt that I certainly don't say that this is true and that is not true, but it was important for me as a writer to provide a platform to multiple realities. If that was a reality, if that was an emotional reality for the waste picker, I could not ignore it or sideline it also.
Well, thank you for sharing this really wonderful, wide-ranging conversation about your book, Castaway Mountain. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for taking the time to talk to all of us and answer these questions so generously. I'd also like to thank Shalini and Sophia for adding to the discussion by presenting your thoughts on the book and raising some really great points that allowed us to step inside the world of the book and the project and the stories that informed it. So with that, thank you, Saumya Roy. For those who haven't read it yet, Castaway Mountain is definitely very important to read. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was an honor to have such a sensitive and thoughtful discussion on my book that brought out all the themes of the book so beautifully.
Thank you, Soumya. And thanks, Akshaya, for managing this.
Thanks, Soumya. This was genuinely just a beautiful, beautiful read. And thank you for writing it.